Elnet has rapidly transitioned to online advocacy programs in response to the coronavirus. And you know that we can't accommodate delegations in Israel right now, so we're moving online very, very intensively. But first of all, we want to thank you for being with us and hope and pray that you and your loved ones are safe and healthy. And we wish you all a happy Passover and happy, healthy Easter. We've engaged over the last 3 weeks over 100 European officials in intensive programs like the one you'll be experiencing today. We're offering programs in several languages focused on Israel's response to the virus, attempts to develop medications and vaccines, the importance of cooperating with Europe, European scientists and European officials, governments, the impact of the pandemic on the Middle East, on security issues, on economic issues, stability, on Iran, Israeli-Palestinian relations that we'll discuss today as well. Now, earlier today, our French colleagues, and some of them are on the call, hosted 112 participants in a similar Zoom meeting. This was a meeting for officials, for members of parliament, for experts, for journalists. It featured France's ambassador to Israel and Israel's ambassador to France. And it was an incredible event and a testament to the reach of our network. In the coming months, we will continue these programs until we can go physical again and accommodate delegations and dialogues and do advocacy on the ground in the countries that we operate in. And then we, of course, have to maintain our network while planning for the day after the virus. And we are very, very thankful for each and every one of the supporters that are on this call. So without further ado, Amos Harel is a very close friend to Elnet. He's participated in many of our programs over the years in educating officials in Europe together with us. He is one of Israel's leading national security analysts, and he's senior defense correspondent for the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. He has covered Israeli security issues for the last 20 years, published 3 books, and won Israel's highest award for excellence in journalism in 2015. Amos, I'd like to begin, and let me just add that he is now, of course, the leading crisis analyst for Haaretz, leading the reporting on the virus and Israel's attempts to curb its spread. So Amos, the breaking news in Israel tonight is about the formation of a new Israeli government, a unity government or an emergency government. If you can maybe give us your thoughts and analysis about this government, where it's headed, who the senior ministers will be, and how the rotation, Prime Minister Netanyahu's trial will affect all this, and maybe a few words about the implications on Israel's international standing and foreign policy.
Hello, David. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. These are tough times. We'll speak about the virus later, I assume, but first a few words about the political situation at home. Right now, the breaking news, as you said, is about an agreement apparently being reached between the Likud on the one hand and Blue and White on the other. Part of the Blue and White Party, which was the main opposition party during the last 3 rounds of elections, as everybody remembers, we've had during the last year or so. So about 2 weeks ago, Blue and White divided into 2. One faction led by Benny Gantz, a former chief of staff of the army and the leader of the joint party, and by Gabi Ashkenazi, again, a former chief of staff of the IDF. One branch of this party decided to join Benjamin Netanyahu's government, while the other, led by Yair Lapid and Bogi Ya'alon, has decided to stick to the opposition, remaining with their old policy of anti-Netanyahu and not joining Netanyahu under any circumstances. So now the negotiations have been held for about 2 weeks. Apparently there's a breakthrough. I don't think that we'll have a unity government before Seder night, which is Wednesday evening here. But probably next week, there may be a situation in which we have a new government. This government, of course, would be a rotation government where Netanyahu will become prime minister for 18 months. And then, according to his promises and according to the agreement with Gantz, Gantz would then become prime minister for the next 18 months. Currently, what we know is that Gantz is supposed to serve as defense minister, and then they will probably switch positions, although it's not exactly clear what kind of a role Netanyahu would play. And as you mentioned, in the background is the prime minister's trial. You may remember that in mid-March, because of the ongoing virus situation, the beginning of the Netanyahu's trial was delayed by 2 months. It's supposed to begin by mid-May. I would assume that this would not be the final date, and we'll see more and more delays. Another main issue is annexation, of course. Again, this seems like old news now, but just 2 or 3 months ago, it was all the rage how Israel should react to President Trump's so-called deal of the century. And will that include an Israeli annexation of parts of the West Bank, maybe the Jordan Valley or areas like that? It hasn't been decided exactly yet. I think they're about to bypass the disagreement over this by agreeing to say something along the lines that this joint government will deal with the issue once it becomes relevant again. That may be September or October. It would be probably affected by President Trump's re-election campaign and his own political calculations with his evangelist base at home in the United States. It remains to be seen how this will affect Israeli politics. My own personal guess is that annexation is not as close as some people on the Israeli right wing would suppose.
Thank you, Amos. And I wanted to follow up, and I will ask a few questions, and then again we'll open it for the floor. And please write your questions on the Zoom chat, or raise your hand, as Lee mentioned before. But how do you evaluate the Israeli government's approach to the coronavirus, the state of play, perhaps the exit strategy? Where are the challenges? Where are the strengths? Because we're all very concerned about the situation, of course.
Okay. First of all, let's start with the actual numbers. As of today, there are 8,600 Israelis who've been inflicted with the virus. We've counted 55 deaths among Israelis, and the number of those who are severely ill on respirators and so on is somewhere around 120. So these are not huge numbers. When you compare that to the situation, the terrible news coming from all over Europe, whether it's Italy or Spain or France or the UK, and now, unfortunately, some states in the United States as well, Israel's situation is better. This has to do with our peculiar circumstances. We have a much younger population. The average age of Israelis is much younger, for instance, than Italians. And we only have one entrance gate to the country, the Ben Gurion airport. You all flew through Ben Gurion many, many times. And once Israel decided to restrict entries to the country in mid-February, and then later on by early March, there were more restrictions. And also, it decided to quarantine people coming back from certain states and then from all over the world. It had a better grasp of the situation than many other countries. Having said that, I think we've lost precious time regarding some of our preparations. For instance, equipment to our medical crews, doctors, nurses, and so on. Not enough has been done over that. And like every other country in the world, we have problems with two major issues. One is ventilators, respirators, and so on. And the other, which is very, very crucial, is tests, corona tests. It has now gone up to somewhere around 6,000 to 7,000 a day, but the government has already decided that it should be more than 10,000 a day. And by last Friday, if I'm not mistaken, the promise was that we would be up to 30,000 a day. Why is this crucial? You can understand this from following the situation back home, whether you're in France or the United States. Getting those numbers is essential to understand how the virus is spreading, developing. What are the places that need more help from the government on the one hand, or perhaps more strict closures around them? The best example for that is a town called Bnei Brak. It's actually a suburb of Tel Aviv. it's ultra-Orthodox. Most of the community there is a Haredi community. They live in densely populated areas, and they're having a very difficult time with the virus, especially because, unfortunately, their own political leaders and their rabbis did not heed to the government's alarm signs about a month ago. This went through Purim celebrations, this went through synagogues and so on. And the situation, unfortunately, right now is that Bnei Brak is leading the country in the number of sick people. Considering its population, it has about 200,000 people, and there are more than 1,000 who are already ill with the virus. These are high numbers by Israeli standards. So what we've seen in the last few days is a full closure on Bnei Brak on the one hand, an attempt by the government to take sick people out of the city, even if they're not in a severe condition, move them to hotels and so on in order to prevent the virus from spreading. And on the other hand, something quite emotional to many Israelis, there are now soldiers, paratroopers inside Bnei Brak, helping those poor families, delivering food, delivering medicine, and trying to help this very, very religious community deal with the situation on the one hand and still prepare for its religious sermons, because as I said, we're approaching Leila Seder night within 2 days. So this is one crucial aspect of our fight against the virus right now. As I said, we're better off than most countries, and I think we should credit the government for some important action that was taken at the right time. Right now, there's a lot of concern and a lot of disappointment because it seems, I'll use an Israeli slang and Israeli words, it seemed like a big balagan, a big mess, because a lot of the decisions are not going through enough process, not enough thinking. And unlike the situation which I've encountered in the past, covering wars and covering Israel's attempts to help on the one hand and defend its home front during wars, here this seems much less organized. I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that we haven't encountered anything like this in the past. There's a big difference between fighting a pandemic on the one hand and fighting a war, even if that war includes a threat to your civilian population.
Thank you, Amos. And how do you evaluate the importance of international cooperation in either exchanging information on vaccines and medications and best practices, and maybe the day after, as Israel emerges from this economic situation, how important, in your assessment, is the connection with the world and specifically with the large economies, Israel's largest trade partner in Europe?
Look, David, there's a sort of a dissonance there because on the one hand, every country is now fighting for its own, every state. It's not a situation, for instance, God forbid, there's an earthquake in Israel, and then the other friendly countries are giving us help. This is not the situation. We're actually competing for the same kind of medicine, the same kind of protective masks for our doctors, the same kind of corona test that I've mentioned, and so on. On the other hand, I think that the fact that this is an international phenomenon and the fact that everybody is hurt by the virus and every economy in the world is hit terribly hard by this crisis means that at one point or another, we will join our efforts in order to solve this. The best example you've already given is, of course, the vaccine. Once this is achieved, and the experts I've spoken to, they think that the ballpark is somewhere between 12 to 18 months, then it will have to be an international effort in order to vaccinate everybody, of course, because otherwise you could not make this pandemic disappear for good. The same goes for exploring possible effective medicine against the virus. And the same goes for regulation, because even if, for instance, some scientists assume that once the weather improves, once it's warmer in the northern part, in the northern hemisphere, then it would be harder for the virus to spread. But this isn't the same for the southern part of the world. Come summer in New Zealand or Australia or Argentina, you will still need the same kind of regulations in order to prevent the virus from spreading again. So a lot of international cooperation will need to be organized here. I know that we're cooperating with many countries, whether it's India, whether it's European countries, whether the United States. We're trying to share experience and to learn from each other. And one good example for that I can give is the fact that actually Mossad, our equivalent of the CIA, in recent weeks is extremely busy at trying to use all kinds of connections that it has for other matters, whether it's India or some of the Gulf states, in order to provide very necessary equipment to the Israeli health system in order to help fighting the virus.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about some other aspects of Israel in terms of security. We have East Jerusalem, where you have a very interesting population in between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. You have the Palestinian Authority itself, and we hear a lot about the cooperation, but we'd love to hear more from you. And the challenge in Gaza in terms of the immediate areas around Israel's borders.
Okay, this is interesting as well. As you know, our relationship with both parts of the Palestinian political map are quite complicated, whether it's the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Palestinian residents in East Jerusalem on the one hand, or the Hamas regime in the Gaza Strip. I wouldn't go as far as saying we're all in this together, but actually what the last month has taught us is that there's quite a lot of room for cooperation. The clearest example of that is what's going on with the West Bank Palestinians. There's a lot of cooperation behind the scenes. Israel is helping them deal with the pandemic, whether it's by delivering equipment or tests, or sharing its medical experience regarding fighting pandemics and so on. I don't think it even needs mentioning that, of course, Israel is much ahead of the Palestinians when it comes to its capabilities, its health system, and so on. And this is done not because we suddenly fell in love, there's suddenly a romance between Netanyahu and Abbas. I doubt if they ever spoke recently, but because both sides need each other. If the pandemic spreads in Israel, it affects the West Bank. And on the other hand, considering the conditions in the West Bank and the fact that the hospital system there is weaker, if it spreads widely in the West Bank, it may come back and haunt us in Israel, even if we do a better job at fighting the virus. So Israel helps the Palestinian Authority. There was actually an agreement, quite a rare agreement, reached about, I think it was 3 weeks ago, in which about 70,000 Palestinian workers, most of them in agriculture and even more than that in the building industry, were permitted to stay in Israel, continue working even under the quite strict closure that we have here right now for Israeli citizens as well, in order to help those industries on the one hand and keep on helping Palestinian economy by bringing back money on the other. This worked for quite some time. Recently, we hear that the Palestinian Authority is a little bit worried because they think that those workers, once they come back home, perhaps I didn't mention that, but those workers are staying inside Israel according to the agreement for 2 months. And now the Palestinians are slightly worried because they say, look, the pandemic is spreading faster in Israel. And if we take those workers back, they may help spread the virus at home in the West Bank. So there's some tension there, but there's quite a lot of cooperation. And this is mainly because we understand that there's no separation between Israel and the West Bank. You've mentioned East Jerusalemites, they're somewhat stuck in the middle. And that if we don't fight the pandemic together, then we will both suffer the same way. Moving on to what's going on in Gaza, that's slightly different. Of course, there are no direct negotiations between Israel and Hamas, but yet, again, both sides rely on each other up to a point. It's the first time ever that Gaza may be happy with the fact that it's rather disconnected from the world. This almost total siege that it has, both from Israel and Egypt, means that less people are traveling from Gaza to the outside, and of course coming to Gaza from the outside world. However, they were also hit by the virus. Two people who came back from Pakistan, probably Hamas members who were there for some kind of Islamic convention, Islamic studying, and so on, brought the virus with them. They were quarantined, but it's assumed now that there are somewhere around 20 people sick with the virus inside the Gaza Strip. The problem there, of course, it's a densely populated area. The infrastructure when it comes to sewage systems, water, electricity is terrible. And the hospitals are very, very poor. So the fear among both Israel and Hamas leadership is that the virus, once it hits, it will spread very, very aggressively. Right now, as far as we know, this hasn't been the case. There's been some help from Israel through the Egyptians, but we've already heard Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, warning Israel at a speech a few days ago, saying, look, if you don't deliver what we need to survive, then you will suffer as well the consequences. And this is, of course, quite a hint that Hamas may be using force, launching rockets and so on, if it's pushed to a corner and it doesn't know how to deal with the medical situation. We're not there yet, but Israel is quite concerned with what's going on with Hamas and the way it deals with the virus, because it may affect what's going on here from a medical point of view, but also from a security point of view. Just imagine a scenario in which we're both fighting the virus and need to react to heavy rocket fire being launched from the Gaza Strip because they are frustrated with the way the pandemic is spreading.
Yeah, there's a lot to be concerned about. Please, everyone on the call, think about your questions. We have a few more minutes. I will follow up with a few questions of my own, but feel free to ask Amos questions about Israel's national security or about the virus or global events. This is an opportunity to hear from one of Israel's top experts. Amos, I wanted to ask you, Iran is one of the countries that was most severely hit by the virus, and there's no end in sight. How do you assess the implications for Iranian policy in the Middle East, regional aggression, the nuclear program, and so on when you think about Iran and analyze the situation?
Okay, that's a very interesting aspect. It's not top of the news here because there's so much else going on, but strategically speaking, this may be crucial. Going back to the situation just a few months before, you may still remember that there were heavier sanctions by the US against Iran, that Iran began a campaign of military provocation against both America and some of its allies in the region, mostly Saudi Arabia, and that in early January, the United States assassinated General Soleimani, who was the head of the Quds force of the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Command. And at that time, it seemed like the most important news in the region. Of course, then the coronavirus hit, and Iran has suffered in a very massive way. Israeli intelligence is assuming that the Iranians are lying here, as they tend to do on many issues. If I'm not mistaken, they reported somewhere around 3,000 to 4,000 deaths. Some Israeli experts assume that the number is somewhere between twice to 5 times that number. So this is devastating. There are maybe even more deaths in Iran than in countries like Italy or Spain. And even more so, this is even more complicated because some of this happened because of Iran's situation with China. The Chinese were helping Iran under this enormous pressure, sanctions pressure from the US, and therefore Iran did not stop flights from China. Later on, the virus spread mostly through flights between Qom, the holiest site, the holiest town for Iranian Shiites, and Tehran. And many of the people close to the regime were inflicted, some even died from the virus in recent months. So Iran is having a very, very hard time, not only because of the fact that the pandemic has spread so much, but because its economy is hurting. And consider the fact that A, the United States is still pushing sanctions, and B, that the oil prices, of course, have gone down in a very massive way. So Iran's economy is in the worst situation it encountered in recent years. There have been pleas by the Iranians, some pleas and some, of course, some threats in order for the Americans to lift some of the sanctions. As far as we can tell right now, the Trump administration is not buying into this. They're saying, look, sanctions relief has nothing to do with medical help. If you want medical assistance from the international community, you can get it. It doesn't mean that we will change our sanctions policy. One could assume that Netanyahu, in those rare hours in which it doesn't deal with fighting the coronavirus or dealing with the national unity government, is extremely worried about the possibility that the Americans would change their mind on Iran. On top of that, we've seen Iran threatening in recent days, not Iran directly, but Shiite militias in Iraq, which are actually financed and ordered and given orders by Iran, threatening America with more retaliation because of the assassination of Soleimani. And I think 2 or 3 days ago, we've even seen President Trump threatening back and saying that the Iranians would pay a price. Right now, we haven't seen more provocations from the Iranians, but the situation there is quite difficult. Moving on from Iran to Lebanon, I should mention that as well. Lebanon has not been hit too hard with the virus yet. Its economy is crashing. That began even before the pandemic started spreading. And especially Hezbollah is in a tight situation for 2 reasons. One, because Iran is no longer able to finance it the way it has in the past because of its own economic problems. And the second reason is that Hezbollah is blamed inside Lebanon for spreading the virus, because much of the people who were inflicted actually came back from Iran. Hezbollah members were going there for meetings and so on. And now, right now, Hezbollah is blamed inside Lebanon for helping the virus spread. So under that situation, if you look at Israel's strategic place in the region right now, I think Israelis are more and more concerned, of course, by the virus and by its economic consequences, because our economy is bleeding and hurting just like everybody else in the world, and less concerned by the possibility of direct confrontation. This can happen because this is the Middle East and everything can happen. But if you look at the government's priorities right now, it's not going to be the military side leading for the next year or 2 or 3. And I'd even make a slight gamble here, saying that the defense budget will suffer when compared to other more extreme and desperate and immediate needs, like helping the economy, the struggling independent businesses on the one hand, or improving our health system on the other.
Thank you. We're going to start questions from our supporters. We have a question from David Becker, Amos, from the Bay Area in the United States. What is the Israeli government attitude for providing more medical aid to Gaza? Does it want to do so for the same reasons that it wants to help the Palestinian Authority, or does it think about it differently?
As I mentioned, yes, we would like to help, not because there's any kind of new romance between Israel and Hamas, but because we understand the possible consequences, the implications, if we let Hamas deal with this by its own. On the other hand, our resources are limited, and it's very, very clear that Israel's own immediate concerns are top of the list. But having said that, I've spoken to the Director General of the Ministry of Health last week, and he told me directly, I consider Gaza a top priority. It's very important to me. Again, not because I'm concerned, because my heart bleeds for the poor Gazans, but because I think this is very, very important in order to prevent the spread of the virus in a way that might affect us. And remember, for years we've been discussing Gaza's poor situation and the possibility that a humanitarian disaster there may have some kind of an effect, direct effect on Israel, on a medical level on the one hand, or on our military situation on the other. And suddenly, this is the situation we're facing, not because of Gaza's own conditions, but because of this world phenomena of the coronavirus. Another point I should make is that there's still this unsolved issue regarding our POWs. You may remember that There are 2 Israeli citizens who crossed the border to Gaza and were not heard from again about 5 years ago. And there are bodies of 2 Israeli soldiers who died in the recent operation in summer 2014. There have been ongoing negotiations over this, and lately Sinwar himself and other people in Hamas leadership in Gaza have hinted that they're willing to renegotiate a deal, perhaps a prisoner swap or something like that, if Israel would be more helpful to Hamas in fighting the virus. This is not happening anytime soon, but this would become an issue, I think, in the next few weeks as Gaza faces a harder situation fighting the pandemic.
Thank you. We have a question from Gerald Platt from Sullivan County in New York, where he says that he's hunkered down, I guess like all of us. There is a large Haredi population here that appears to be ignoring the guidelines vis-a-vis social distancing, gloves, and masks. Apparently, Israel is experiencing similar issues in Bnei Brak. He'd like you to comment on that, and you did at the beginning. But he's specifically concerned about anti-Semitism, certainly overseas, not so much in Israel, but the reaction overseas to this kind of a phenomenon.
Okay, thanks for this question. I think it's a very important issue. There are similarities between the situation in Brooklyn, Borough Park, and so on, and the situation in Bnei Brak. And in some cases, there were actually Hasidim who left Borough Park area or Brooklyn because of deteriorating situation there at the Haredi community, and went back home or moved to Israel, considering the circumstances in the US. And some of them have actually brought illness with them. So this is a volatile issue, a vulnerable point here as well. Having said that, Bnei Brak, it's an interesting issue. It's not that the Haredi community at large ignored everything, but I think that the leadership is somewhat to blame here. Both the rabbis were not quick to act. The only thing that got them moving and to begin addressing this issue is the way the pandemic hit back home, back in your home in New York, and after many Haredi men and women unfortunately died in New York, suddenly people in Bnei Brak understood what was beginning to happen. On top of this, some of you may be familiar with this fact. Our health minister is actually a Haredi, a leader of one of the Haredi parties, Yaakov Litzman, and on top of everything else, he's now ill with the virus himself and quarantined. But it is Litzman himself who ignored his own Ministry of Health's recommendations for quite some time, did not, for instance, continued shaking hands and so on, continued attending prayers when the government's position was that minyans should be stopped and people should not go to synagogues, and did everything in his power quite late on through March to get exemptions for the Haredi community. And now, of course, I wouldn't say chicken coming home to roost, but this is a very problematic issue inside the Israeli society. It's not the Haredi community itself. And in recent days, they've been obeying every order and every recommendation by the government. But the general feeling is that the rabbis and that the political leadership were avoiding this issue for too long and not heeding to the alarms set by the medical experts and so on. And there's been hell to pay for that. And that's, of course, is extremely troubling. Right now, as I said, Bnei Brak is getting a lot more help, but the numbers are growing there and there are many people ill there. I've talked to one IDF officer who's busy helping the community, the Haredi community in Bnei Brak in the last few days. And he said something very sad to me. He said there are only 2 types of people in Bnei Brak: those who are already hit with the virus and those that are going to be ill soon. So this is terrible news. Hopefully, the government and especially the army would be quick to react, and we've already seen slight signs of improving the situation there. But we may be facing a possible disaster there, which would be terrible for the city, but would also affect the whole country. I'm not talking only numbers. As you probably are familiar with right now, the main issue here is, and we've seen that happen in Italy and later on, unfortunately, in recent days in some of the hospitals in New York City. The question is how many people are actually reaching the ICUs and need intensive care. And if suddenly there's the pandemic hits in a major way in a city such as Bnei Brak, this may mean that thousands of people would reach the hospitals and need respirators, ventilators, and so on. And this is the fear, not not the statistics, but the actual effect that this may have on hospitals, which may crush under the pressure. Thankfully, so far, we've done pretty well with that. We've been organized, social distancing. The decision was made quite early. There was also a decision or a recommendation made for older people, especially people over the age of 70 and 75, to stay at home. This has happened for the last 3 or 4 weeks. And what we see, the result of that are, of course, less deaths, because if people are keeping their distance and the older people who can be hurt more badly by the virus are staying at home, then there's less of a chance of people getting sick or and their situation deteriorating. So Israel has taken some action. The problem with the Haredi community may affect Israel's overall results, and that's a problem, of course.
Thank you. Gerald, I'll just add that the problem of anti-Semitism, especially in the midst of this crisis, of this virus, is something that Elna takes very seriously. In our work with European government, it's critical to making sure that laws are passed, that restrictions are put on that kind of behavior in Europe. We don't deal directly with the United States, obviously, but much of this begins in Europe, and that's where the core of our work is, especially on these issues on a daily basis. So thank you for your question. I wanted to call on Aria Ben Simon. He is the director of Elnet in France, and he has a question for Amos.
Yes. Shalom, Amos. Can you hear?
Shalom.
Can you hear well?
Yeah,
Yeah, I can hear well.
I would like to ask you one question about the internal situation in Israel that is connected to the COVID-19 situation. Are you one of those who think that the Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu is using the crisis for partisan political affairs? And if the measures that are taken in terms of digital control endanger the democracy? I ask this question because this week we had in all the newspaper in France interview by Yuval Noah Harari, and it's exactly what he was claiming to the French audience. And I think that it's something that is harming the image of Israel. Do you think that it's something that can be relevant in your the assessment that you have about this subject?
Okay, thank you for the question. One thing perhaps I should add on the other issue, David, we've discussed anti-Semitism abroad, but there's also some trend of anti-Semitism inside Israel towards the Haredi community right now. And this is terribly worrying, because if we break this pact between the different parts of the Israelis over the coronavirus and we start blaming each other for spreading it, this may have some dire consequences for the Israeli society. Now, Aria, getting back to your question, this is a very volatile discussion right now in Israel. It divides the country into half. And remember from our previous talks how much of the discussion during the last 3 campaigns, and remember, we've had 3 elections during 1 year, how much of this was about Netanyahu. I sometimes jokingly called the situation to Bibi or not to Bibi. That was the issue for a long time. The whole discussion was whether you're for Netanyahu or against Netanyahu. And the main reason why we went to elections time after time was not ideological. It was not split in half between right and left. Actually, most of the country has moved gradually from the center towards the right in recent years. We've discussed that in the past. It was whether you supported Bibi or you hated him and wanted him out. The best example for that is, of course, Avigdor Lieberman, who's a right-wing politician and yet refuses for free election campaigns in a row to join Netanyahu's government. So Netanyahu is in the middle of that, and he has to be a saint not to consider political calculations while making the decision. This doesn't mean that the COVID-19 is not a terrible threat to Israel. And when you see things going so badly in countries like Italy or Spain or the United States, of course, there's a significant threat there and actions need to be taken. Having said that, some of Netanyahu's responses were worrying, whether it was his fight that had to do with the chairperson of with the Knesset speaker, Yuli Edelstein, who actually refused for the first time to obey a direct order from the Supreme Court. There was a Supreme Court decision, and he decided to disobey it for about 48 hours. And some of Netanyahu's actions as well, whether it's the decision by the Minister of Justice, as I said, at the exact moment to delay, to postpone the beginning of Netanyahu's trial and so on. So I can't tell you, having followed Netanyahu quite carefully for the last 20 years and having met with him many times and so on, he has to be a saint not to consider his personal issues when he makes those decisions. And the tendency here was to feel that some of the alarmist statements he made had to do with his quite particular situation when it comes to the political negotiations on the one hand, and his legal problems, the fact that he was about to be indicted. Yet, I can also say that much of the decisions that he has taken were needed under the circumstances. The other issue is what you talked about, digital surveillance and so on. This has to do with Shin Bet, what we call Shabak. In a way, it's our equivalent of the MI5 or the FBI. This is the first time that Shin Bet has been following Israeli citizens and that we knew about it. Shin Bet is about fighting terrorism, and suddenly it covers our digital actions. It follows everybody's cellular phones, and it knows everything about us. This is of course, for the greater good, because what Netanyahu has been saying is we need to follow everybody's actions and movements, because we need to tell you if you are around somebody who turns out to be sick with the virus. We need to tell you that in order for you to self-quarantine and to prevent the virus, the pandemic, from spreading more quickly. Again, the fact that half of the country does not believe Netanyahu in any way means that people are suspicious towards these actions. I can tell you that as a journalist, I'm quite worried about that. Of course, that I want to know if I was near somebody who had the virus. On the other hand, I have no intention of telling the government who my sources are, who I'm meeting with, or who I'm corresponding with, whether it's by WhatsApp or talking on the cell phone and so on. So people are quite tense about this, and Harari's remarks are not totally out of context. I think that his political positions are affecting what he says about Netanyahu. But I have to say that the sense among many people on the center left right now is that there is some danger to Israel's democracy, because some of the actions being taken by the government could not only be explained by the virus and the pandemic, but also with this very, very peculiar situation in which we are, the fact that we've had free elections on the one hand, and that our prime minister, the first time we have a sitting prime minister who's facing an indictment. This is a big issue here right
now. Thank you. We have a question from Dale Aloof. Dale, I'm going to unmute you, and you could ask your question, please.
How are you? I'd be interested to know if you had any thoughts on the effects of the coronavirus on Egypt and Jordan's stability and the implication for Israel's national security, and if you think that Israel should be involved in somehow contributing to helping these countries.
Thank you. Yes, I think this is already happening. As far as we know, Israel is advising those countries, and I wouldn't be too surprised if Israel, behind the scenes, is helping them with testing and so on. Right now, neither Jordan nor Egypt has been hit very, very aggressively by the pandemic. But we have to say on the other hand that these are two free world countries, third world countries, and that their health systems are very, very different from what you're familiar with, whether in Israel or in Europe. And I would assume that the pandemic there is spreading more than they actually admit or even know, even if they have no intention of hiding, which is always a question with authoritarian regimes. They may not know because not enough testing, not enough expertise, and so on. Israel is in a very, very different situation. Of course, Israel is always worried about the stability of its two closest allies in the region, Jordan and Egypt, and the same goes, I would assume, for Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states. The problem with Jordan and Egypt, which are different than the Gulf states, is the fact, of course, that both countries are very, very poor. So we're probably even more concerned than in the past. And if you have a spreading pandemic, and if it does spread all over the place, it could endanger the stability of both Jordan and Egypt. Right now, it seems that Jordan is the Arab country taking this in the most serious way. There's been full closure in Jordan for quite 2 or 3 weeks. I've seen the king addressing his citizens a few times. One thing I should mention, of course, the health system there is nothing compared to what's going on in Israel and so on. They're much behind us. One issue I should mention is that in most of these countries, there are not many old people. That the percentage of old people is much smaller than it is in European countries, and therefore I think less people are in danger. But if it hits hard in either Egypt, in Jordan, or especially Egypt, then there will be many, many deaths in these countries, and this is of course unfortunate for them, but also troubling for us.
Thank you. We have a question from Joan Lurie. Joan, can you ask your question?
Certainly. I just read this morning that the Palestinian Authority has written to the Security Council of the UN accusing Israel of hampering the Palestinian Authority's efforts to stop the epidemic, in spite of the truth, which is that Israel is actually assisting the PA. This came from Danny Danon, your ambassador to the UN, and I'm a great admirer of his. And I'm wondering what, if anything, the Israeli government is doing to try once more to bring truth to the United Nations. And by the way, I spend a lot of my time volunteering at the United Nations, so I know that when it comes to Israel, truth is in very short supply. So I'm just wondering if any extra efforts are being made to correct this perception.
I would assume what you say is, of course, I agree with you. That's true for a long time, especially in the UN. And I haven't heard of this this development, but I'm not too surprised. It's always the double game that the Palestinians are playing. On the one hand, cooperating with Israel and receiving assistance and so on, and on the other hand, playing this blame game towards Israel, blaming it for their problems and so on. So I wouldn't be too surprised that this has happened. I can tell you that behind the scene, there's quite a lot of cooperation, as I've mentioned before, between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. But this is not rare or terribly surprising. It's the same kind of game that the Palestinian Authority has been playing in the past. I hope that the fact that Israel is in fact helping them, and that the fact that the pandemic has not spread terribly in West Bank towns would help us relieve this tension. And they need us as much as we need them regarding this. But this game at the UN would probably continue some way or another, as we've seen in the last decades.
Thank you. If there are any other questions, we'd like to hear them now. Any of you who want to ask Amos another question, we have another 3 to 4 minutes before we begin wrapping up the session. So if anyone has additional questions, please add them or raise your hand. Amos, I will just second what you just said. We're hearing reports that despite the cooperation, there is a double game being played, and the Palestinian Authority is warning its people that the source of the virus is coming from Israel, and therefore they need to burn Israeli goods or turn back, Israeli exports into the Palestinian Authority. So that's unfortunate, but as you said, we hope that the cooperation will overcome that kind of experience, because it's very unfortunate. And the importance of having these kinds of discussions with European leaders again, should be spelled out very clearly. This is an opportunity for Israeli experts to come and explain firsthand what is really happening so that they don't necessarily believe press releases or mendacious headlines